Donovan Griffith joined the Illinois Manufacturers Association early 2018 and today serves as the Senior Director of Government Affairs. In this position, Donovan manages the IMA's legislative agenda at the state capitol, oversees the Manufacturers Environmental Group, and went to Knox College where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science. He is married with 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Donovan to our commission. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. As you said, I'm Donovan Griffith, Senior Director of Government Affairs for the Illinois Manufacturers Association. What that means is I primarily lobby and advocate on behalf of manufacturers in the state of Illinois. Of course, the term lobbyist isn't always the most well-loved term, so I tend to go with advocate. As he said, I have been with the IMA for about 6 years. Before joining the IMA, I was the Deputy Director of the Illinois EPA, which leads me to handle most of our environmental issues. And then before that, I was a Senior Advisor to Governor Rauner, so depending on where you stand on that, either you're welcome or I'm sorry. Usually it's one strong belief one way or the other. So, but no, I've been doing this for about 15 years. And again, been with the IMA for about 6 years. The Illinois Manufacturers Association itself is actually the oldest manufacturing association in the country. We're actually 1 year older than the National Association of Manufacturers, and we're also one of the largest. We have about 4,000 member facilities across the state. And so we get involved in every issue you can think of down in Springfield and across the state, whether it's tax policy, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, and environmental issues like environmental justice. We get involved in a lot of it. And again, because of my experience being with the Illinois EPA and for about 3.5 years, 1 year as Deputy Director, I handle a lot of those issues. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today about environmental justice and what's happening in Springfield, because it's actually probably one of the #1 issues facing manufacturers today, not just in Illinois, but across the country. And Illinois is actually one of the leading states pushing some of the most progressive leading legislation that will have large impacts on manufacturers in terms of environmental justice. Now, I'm a political science major, so we'll see if my technology skills can get me through a PowerPoint. But also, I think my toughest job after that lunch is to keep you all awake. That was a serious lunch. Thank you, Ted. I should also point out, Ted, thank you for the invitation to be here. Give it up for Ted. CAIC, we work very closely with CAIC. Ted joins us in our DC fly-in. It's meeting with members of the Illinois delegation. He's going to be joining us again this year. I always say it's really important for manufacturers to get involved locally. I say you should be involved or a member of 3 things: a local group like CAIC or VIA or wherever you're located, get involved in a state group like the IMA, shameless plug, and also get involved in a national group like the National Association or something specific to your trades, because we all play an important role to make sure that manufacturers can keep working. So Ted, thank you for the invitation, but also thank you for everything that you and your group do. Maybe one day I'll get an invitation to the White Sox game. So I guess I'll just kind of start off. I think everyone here probably knows the basics, but just in case we don't, environmental justice and what we're talking about here. And this is taken strictly off the Illinois EPA's website. The US EPA is going to have a different definition. Other groups and associations and organizations are going to have different definitions. And the reason for that is, in Illinois, environmental justice is not a law. There are no regulations on the books in Illinois on environmental justice, except for the state does have an Environmental Justice Commission that I sit on. The Governor Pritzker appointed me that about 4 years ago, and we've met maybe twice in the last 3 years. So it's not a very active commission. So what environmental justice is, it's the policy of the state of Illinois. The problem with having a policy is that it can be applied however the agency sees fit. One of the good parts about when you have stuff actually in laws and rules and regulations, there is a guideline on how these things need to be applied by the agencies that enforce it. With this just being a policy, I think one of the issues, and we'll talk about in a little bit, is the Illinois EPA applies different restrictions on different companies and different permits depending on the circumstance. And so that's one of the issues we're facing today for companies looking to get a permit or expand, get a modified permit or expand in an area that is an environmental justice area. As far as environmental justice and manufacturing goes, by and large, I think that manufacturers agree with the principle of environmental justice and that everyone should have equity in their environment and everyone should have the ability to live and be in a clean environment. That is not something that we disagree with. Where we generally have disagreements with environmental groups and those legislators pushing legislation is what does that mean? And we often say environmental justice also has to be discussed in the same framework as economic justice. Because if we push regulations for certain areas of the state that are going to, in the name of environmental justice, that are going to help provide a better environment, a potential better environment for these communities, what's the impact going to be on the businesses of those communities? And we think that some of the legislation that's been introduced is going to be great. Because what we've seen here in Illinois, and I'll go through this here in a second, is regulations that will really stunt economic growth in environmental justice communities. The entire city of Chicago, essentially, especially the South Side, is an environmental justice community. I actually lived in Lansing for a year. I'm familiar with the area. I've had a lot of bad rounds of golf at Coyote Run. So, but I'm familiar with this in the EJ area. So, again, we are past the point, and we might have had these discussions 5 or 6 years ago about the need for environmental justice regulations. We are past that, especially in Springfield when we're talking about regulations. We're now on to the point of we've accepted environmental justice. We just have to make sure that those regulations are done in a proper manner. Before we look at Illinois, though, kind of looking what other states are doing. So across the country in the last 2 years, there's been over 150 bills in all the states introduced to bring forth environmental justice regulations. And that can mean a lot of things. Some of these bills might create a task force to look at the issue. Some of the bills might create a simple, well, in this one instance, you have to get local approval before you can get a permit. And then you see things like we've seen here in Illinois where regulations are introduced that would completely turn permitting on its side and say if you're in an EJ area and you want a permit, you have to go through about 10 different steps, pay a few $100,000 more, and because of environmental justice, if you don't do all those things, the state can deny your permit and you wouldn't be able to operate. The first state actually that approved environmental justice legislation was New Jersey. That was done in 2010. That was done early 2010, just about 3 weeks ago. So 3 years later, New Jersey approved their rules. And so we haven't really been able to see what these laws and regulations and rules are going to do on the businesses in New Jersey. But I can tell you the state is already struggling with permits that are coming in. When I talk to the New Jersey Manufacturing Association, this is their number one issue in the state right now. They have other, workforce, all these other issues. They're most concerned about environmental justice because the law that they passed in New Jersey is very similar to what they're trying to do here in Illinois. That is a lot of words on here, and I'll let you read. I'm not one that's just going to read off a PowerPoint, but I think the most important thing to take off this page, and what we also see here in Illinois, is the last line where disproportionate impacts are not avoided if a company cannot cease to increase their emissions in environmental justice areas when getting a permit or renewing a permit, then their permits can be denied by the state, and they would have to cease operations. So right now, New Jersey is the leading state. Other states, I said, have introduced stuff, but nothing as intense as New Jersey. But I'm here to talk about Illinois and what Illinois is doing. So since 2001, is everything all right? Yeah, I'm just going to move this. Okay. Since 2001, we've had over a dozen bills filed in the Illinois General Assembly. So we have session that runs from January to May, and then we have a 2-week veto session in November, December time, and then we had a lame duck session after every election. So we have essentially about 6 months to get things done in Illinois. I'll go through this in a minute, but generally speaking, the Illinois legislature introduces about 6,000 bills a year. So one of my jobs is to read each one of those bills and see how they impact manufacturers. And a lot of those lately have involved environmental justice. So these are just some of the bills that have been introduced. Again, create a council, look at some new requirements that you can put on industry. One of the big discussions last year that hasn't really popped up this year is community benefit agreements. That means before you get or can renew your permit, if you have a CAP or FESOP or some federally enforceable air permit, you would have to get approval from the community you're in before that Illinois EPA can consider renewing or approving your permit. And community benefit agreements means, okay, if you are in my community and you have a permit to emit whatever particles you may be emitting at your facility, the community, the county board, or the city council, whatever your authoritative community would be at that situation, can say, well, before you get our approval for your permit, we would like you to do some stuff for the community. We would like you to put in a park across the street. We want you to plant 500 trees in the community before you can get your permit. So basically, the community you're in gets the first say in what you can do before you can get or renew a permit. So that has not been renewed this year, but it's something that's being discussed. Again, these are some more bills. Now we're into 2023. This is what we're dealing with now. The first bill actually will become law. It creates a Justice 40 Oversight Committee. That is essentially creating a new Environmental Justice Commission, despite the fact that the current commission never meets. So it's really more lip service than any actual policy. And then House Bill 2520 I'm going to go into in a minute because that is what we're facing right now. House Bill 2520 is one of the biggest threats to manufacturing in the state of Illinois today when it comes to environmental justice. And then I'm also going to talk about Senate Bill 852 because that is the bill the IMA introduced. We actually introduced our own environmental justice bill this year, and I'll talk about that. And I would be remiss if I also didn't talk about the city of Chicago. My focus is on statewide policies, but we also focus on Chicago as well. The mayor, on her way out, she did pass a new executive order that basically says we're going to continue to have these discussions. The Environmental Justice Commission that she created will continue to meet. Mayor Johnson has also continued that commission, so that's going to continue to meet. And while they haven't gotten very far yet, I'm guessing the city of Chicago is probably going to place more onerous regulations than the state does, which is really saying something. But they're really in the infancy of this new administration, so we can't really get into details of what they're discussing because they are just now reforming that commission. But my main focus today is going to be talking about House Bill 2520. So basically, what this bill does is, in the name of environmental justice, is that it says if you have a CAP or a FESOP, or if you have an operating permit right now at your facility, and you need to get a new one, if you're going to modify your current one, if you are going to do a minor modification, but if any emissions are going to be increased, you have to go through these select things in order to get that permit. And I'll kind of go through one by one, but one of the most important things is, what is an environmental justice community? Where are they? What does it mean to be an environmental justice community, right? And so what the state does right now is the state uses census data on poverty and race, and looks at areas with I'm trying to think of the number. You have to meet a certain poverty level, or you're a majority minority population area. Those are the two things the state uses right now to determine each area. What the environmental groups want to do is they want to expand that. That says 100 different principles can go into what makes an EJ area. Okay? So let's say that there is an instance at a facility and they had an increase in emissions for 2 days, and that might have been a violation. Well, they say, well, a company if the area is not an EJ area, but a company violates their regulations or their permitted emission limits, that community can now be an EJ area. And under their mapping process, there's an algorithm where they cannot explain to us where an environmental justice community will be. Now, you guys here in the South Side are an environmental justice area. I imagine you always will be, regardless of what parameters go into that. So that might not be as big an issue for you here, but certainly a bigger issue downstate where environmental justice areas aren't as prevalent. opt in. They want communities that are not environmental justice areas to be able to just opt in and say we want to be one. So if you have a facility that's going in down the street and you don't want them there, you can say, well, we're an environmental justice area. And so now you have to go through the environmental justice process. And it's nearly that easy. And so that's very problematic for us as well. Local siting, that kind of goes to the community benefit agreement. You'd have to go to the county board and get approval before you can renew your permits at your facilities, or before you can get a new permit if you need one. Additional public hearings. This is actually one of the areas we agree on. I think, again, if you go back to what the Illinois EPA has listed on what an environmental justice community is, this last point here, meaningful involvement of all people, I think that's something we can agree on. If we have to have additional conversations with the communities that we're in, I think we can certainly get behind that. And actually, if you look at all three of these dot points, protecting the environment of Illinois, the state should be doing that already. That shouldn't be a new point. Equity in the administration of state's environmental programs, again, that should be done already, and how to regulate that is questionable how they do that. Really what we're talking about is dot point 3 here with all these things that are being introduced. Completion of environmental justice assessment. I'm going to go over this in my next slide, so I'm going to skip that just because this is going to be where a lot of the bread and butter is of what they're trying to do. Third-party grievance process. That means if you have a permit that you're trying to renew here, you're going to increase your emissions, so you're going to go through the environmental justice permitting process. If I live in Springfield and you're going to increase your emissions here, I can file a grievance against you because it's affecting the air that I breathe in our country, so it allows basically anyone, anywhere to file a grievance against any permit being issued by the state. And then they also added a fund $200,000 additional permitting fee in their bill. So this was introduced this year. I should back up. We've been talking about this issue with environmental groups and legislators in earnest since 2001. And we've been voicing our frustrations with them. We've been giving them feedback, and we continue to see similar things be introduced without taking any of our feedback into consideration. So it's unfortunate that this bill was reintroduced this year. Fortunately, we were able to stop it, and I'll go over that in a minute. But I wanted to get into this point, which I talked about here a second ago, completion of environmental justice assessment and what that means. If you are in an environmental justice area, which you are here, I imagine a lot of you have CAP or FESOP permits, some type of federally enforceable air permits if you're a manufacturing facility. If you are going to be renewing that permit, or if for some reason you can make a modification to it, or if you are expanding and actually need to do an additional permit, you would have to do all these steps. You'd have to do dispersion modeling. The modeling would have to be have to follow the impacts of air quality and for both standard conditions and non-standard conditions. That means you'd have to do dispersion modeling for the worst case scenario and the best case scenarios. And then you'd have to do an environmental impact evaluating, and this is going to be an important word too, cumulative environmental impacts within the environmental justice community, because what isn't a cumulative environmental impact, and it gets worse, unfortunately. That environmental impact means you have to do a quantitative and qualitative assessment on emission-related impacts that your permit might have on the community. Well, I don't know how you would do a qualitative impact. When we're doing permitting, for those in the permitting world, we talk about numbers, right? And so qualitative has been a huge part of the discussion of what that means and how companies can do it. But these are certain things that you'd actually have to do. You'd have to do an assessment on how your permits, how your operating permits would impact respiratory issues, how it would impact neurological issues, how it would impact cancer rates. So now all of a sudden you're a manufacturing facility and you want to continue operating in the state of Illinois. Well, now when you renew that permit, you're going to have to do an assessment on how that permit might impact cancer rates. I'm not even sure how that can be done. And the environmental groups pushing this legislation don't have a lot of answers either. And so, again, the theme here is if you don't do these things, the state can deny your permit for not doing them. And so, it's again, it's going to be really problematic and hard to operate. So this is the bill that was been introduced and discussed in Springfield. I've now testified about 15 times in legislative hearings. So if you ever turn on C-SPAN and it's boring, some guy sitting at a table talking to like 3 guys at a booth, that's basically what I'm doing, but on environmental justice. And We actually were able to successfully stop this bill. It passed through committee, but then it went to the House, and it failed on the House floor in March. It needed 60 votes to pass and only got 57. And then the environmental groups tried to get all their folks together, and they called this bill for a vote again last week, and it failed by only getting 57 votes again. So we're able to stop this bill from moving this year. However, stopping this bill does not mean the issue stops in Illinois. They're going to continue to push. We have to look at a couple things. We have to look at the political atmosphere in Illinois. You know, the Democrats have every constitutional office. They have supermajorities both the House and Senate. The political atmosphere is right for something to move in environmental justice. Okay? And so we have to be ready. Even though we stop this year, there's going to be more pushes for environmental justice legislation. So instead of just saying no to this, the IMA, we worked with a coalition of business groups, and we decided we're going to introduce our own bill to get ahead of this. And we did this on a few different principles. These are the principles that we kind of decided, if we get environmental justice regulations in the state of Illinois, this is what those regulations should and should not do. We need to know where environmental justice areas are. It's important for you, it's important for manufacturers in general. The two top things people always tell me they want is consistency and clarity. They want to know, okay, am I in an environmental justice area? If I am today, am I going to be tomorrow? And what's that mean for how I operate? So that needs to happen. We need to define, if you are in an EJ area, then what that means. We need to have outreach with the community. Again, that's one of the areas where I said I think there's a lot of agreement. We also need to have a criteria for what the outcomes are going to be. If I'm in an EJ area and I need to get a permit, am I going to be denied that permit? I need to know these things. And then, of course, should not, and I won't just read off of a slide deck, but you can kind of see some of the things that we think are issues that absolutely should not be part of any environmental justice regulation. So what we did is we introduced our own bill. And I'm sorry, it's been busy during session, so I kind of put the slide deck together last night, so I did utilize clip art, so hope you'll forgive me on that. So we introduced Senate Bill 852 this year. What this does is establishes regulations. And again, the IMA, we worked with the State Chamber of Commerce, the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce, ERG, and the Illinois Farm Bureau to get our proposal together. And I will tell you this before we kind of go into what the proposal is, we do not take it lightly as a manufacturing association that we have introduced a legislative proposal in Springfield that puts regulations on manufacturers. Okay, that's not something, we've worked on this for over a year because it's not something we take lightly, but it's something that needs to be done because environmental justice will eventually happen in Illinois. And we don't want to just be saying no on the sidelines when it passes. We want to get something through that's meaningful to us. And again, what I talked about earlier is once we get something in statute, we know what the rules and regulations are. The Illinois EPA just can't apply whatever they want whenever they want, right? So what we did with this bill is we clearly defined what EJ area is by using minority and poverty data. We ensure that it only applies to new cap and fee stop permits or if you're doing a significant modification that will lead to significant increases in emissions. Okay, so we're really narrowing down who these regulations would apply to. We do allow for the opt-in if the community can prove that the state screwed up in using the data to determine EJ areas, but then we also allow to opt out. So let's say this area, let's say Calumet City is an EJ area, and the community decide we don't want to be an EJ area. There's a process they can go through to opt out. We remove the quantitative and qualitative analysis. Instead, what we'd say is you have to do modeling and you have to do an analysis on that modeling. We lower the fine from $200,000 to $500, admittedly as a negotiation point. And then we do allow for grievances, but they cannot just be third-party grievances from anywhere. So, again, the reason for this is we know that environmental justice regulations are coming in Illinois. We want to be the ones that are leading the discussions on that. We don't want environmental groups who have been leading the discussions and pushing regulations for years to be the ones to do that. If this bill became law, it would have a tremendous impact on industry and a tremendous impact on the communities that have manufacturers in them. Because if I'm a business looking to move or expand, and I know, well, I can come to the Calumet area, but I have to go through the environmental justice, or I can go to Bolingbrook and not have to worry about that. I'm going to go to Bolingbrook, right? Because I'm not going to have all these permit restrictions on me. This will negatively impact not just the businesses, but the communities which those businesses call home. So I will tell you, our bill is not moving this spring. There will be no environmental justice bill moving this spring. Discussions are going to continue throughout the summer. I'll tell you where the IMA is, where the environmental groups are. We were talking weekly until we killed their bill for a second time this year, and then they've cut off our discussions. But we do expect them to continue on through the summer. So right now, nothing in the immediate future. We'll see what happens during the fall veto session. And so I can take questions on environmental justice. I just want to also touch on just a couple issues now. This will take just 1 minute. Again, about 12,000 bills are filed every 2 years that General Assembly exists. And one of the biggest issues we have is convincing people that this is not what manufacturing is today. This is what manufacturing is today. So one of the biggest things for the IMA is trying to fight back on this perception, and environmental justice plays into that perception. And then these are some various issues. I put this in here as a shameless plug to Ted, that picture, some propaganda. But these are also some issues that you need to be aware of. These are environmental issues that are likely going to be moving in the next few years. PFAS regulations. Actually, the state of Illinois is behind on PFAS regulations because we were working so hard on ethylene oxide for so many years when other states were passing PFAS regulations that we expect that to happen soon. But these are just some other issues I kind of wanted to put on your radar. But otherwise, I thought it'd be best if we just took questions. Thank you very much, Don. Right. Can you speak to those two things? Yeah, yes, I can. And I didn't give the history because I assume all of you who are in this area understands the history of EJ and certain things have happened in this area, so I didn't go through that. But first, the reason people did not vote for it is that we've been putting together a strong advocacy team educating those legislators on the negative impacts this will have on communities. I've gone into meetings with legislators and said, if this facility can't get their permit, they're going to cease to operate. And they say, manufacturers don't hire people in my district. They all come from outside the district and work and then go home. They don't provide any community benefits. I tell them I find that very hard to imagine. And if every legislator says that, well then workers just come from nowhere. But no, we've been educating them and telling them the negative impacts, and also really just sharing with them that we have an idea. And that's why it was really important for us to introduce our own bill, is so that we're not just saying no, but also here's a framework that could work, that will allow for the community to be more involved in the permitting process, but without it being onerous on businesses, so to ensure that they can continue to operate and can get their permit in a timely manner. And so that's one of the reasons. Jobs are important, yes, but also showing them that there is a framework where you can do it right, that it won't be negative on the businesses and on the communities. So that's why it was important for us to introduce our own bill. Again, if we can define what EJ areas are, if we can create regulations such as, all right, if you need one of these permits, fine. You are required to do some modeling, which, by the way, the Illinois EPA requires of you now because it's a policy of the state. Nothing in what we've put out there is actually different from what the Illinois EPA is doing now with permits. We left some things out. For example, right now, if you're in an EJ area and you're doing a significant modification to your permit and you're increasing emissions, the Illinois EPA is going to come to you and say, well, you can't increase emissions. You have to be net zero on emission increases. We're not putting that in our proposal, but we're using some of the basics of what the Illinois EPA is doing as part of their policy. Your second question was US EPA and Illinois EPA. They are still meeting almost weekly to discuss a settlement from what Region 5 and Illinois EPA, again, I'm sure you all are very familiar with the situation that Illinois that has led to this settlement discussion. They have, for the first time last week, kind of gotten some pen to paper, but I do know that both Region 5 and Illinois EPA want us to pass a state law because they have something to point to, and it takes the pressure off them. They're actually hoping for environmental justice regulation to get through. That way they can say, well, we have a framework, this is what we have to follow. I do believe that they will come out probably before we get a law passed because we're so far apart on where we are. And it's the restrictions that the US EPA is going to force the Illinois EPA to abide to are going to be very similar to what we have in our own proposal. So if you have a cap or fee stop and you want to get your permit renewed or get a new one, you're going to have to do some modeling, probably some dispersion modeling, probably an analysis of that modeling. But what it's not going to have is the quantitative and qualitative health impacts that permit might have on the community. So, but nothing's settled there. They're still having discussions. That's just from my conversations with the EPA.
Do you have any expectations on timing? Because lots of permits are held up because of this.
Yes, lots of permits are held up. No, I don't. I mean, they've been having discussions for a year. And I just know that they got pen to paper for the first time on getting some proposals down, but I think they're still a ways away from agreeing on that. I do think it will happen before we get regulations through in the state.
Other questions? Question? Anyone?
Yeah.
Now, when you're doing an environmental assessment, in the bigger picture, if somebody's looking for environmental adjustment area, does transportation commission figure into the equation, or just the process itself?
Under the proposal's been introduced by environmental groups, you'd have to do an assessment of both. You have to do the assessment of what your facility is doing and how that will impact the community, but then also take into consideration other sources around you. So you'd have to do different assessments, different modeling, which is just going to double your costs. You really have to cover all the bases. It's very in-depth on what they would like you to include in your assessment. So the answer is yes. You would do just your facility, but then also take other sources around you into consideration.
First and foremost, thank you very much for your time today, Donovan. This has been very insightful. But my question for you is, did New Jersey ever have another bill proposed before the bill got passed through? Or is this something new that's going to be happening in Illinois?
Is this something new that's going to be happening in Illinois?
Yeah, in terms of the bill that you guys are proposing against this other bill.
I'm not a New Jersey expert. From my understanding is they were working with them on the legislation but didn't propose their own bill. I believe that in Illinois we are the first business coalition to introduce our own environmental justice bill. And I've been encouraging my partners in other states to do the same. Because again, we are not going to stop environmental justice regulations from eventually becoming law. What we can do is ensure that those regulations are palatable to manufacturers so it doesn't hinder their ability to operate and doesn't slow down permitting processes and doesn't cost millions of dollars. So I hope that answered your question. I think someone had a question.
I don't know if you know anything about as far as the city's requirements, the Chicago requirements, air quality ordinance, et cetera. Do you have any details on that? I know a lot of it's pretty gray. I know a lot of it's really gray.
Yeah. Relatively new, and I know that again, on the mayor on the way out wants to continue those discussions. I don't have the in-depth detail what Chicago is going to be requiring. However, I think it's going to be very similar when you're talking about the cumulative impact. I think that's going to be a big part of it, and the assessments that you have to do to prove what your facility. It's essentially the city or the state saying, okay, if you want to operate here, tell me what your facility does to the health and environment of the community around you. Both alone and then with other sources around you, right? Also taking impact, all right, you have another manufacturer down the street, that has to be included in that as well. So I know that that's a big focus for them as well, but I don't have all the details what the city of Chicago is specifically trying to do.
One more question, anyone? Is that it? Well,
Hopefully that wasn't too in the weeds or too boring. I kind of get into my...
No, not at all. I got a question now
Yeah.
on the environmental justice. So you mentioned minority communities and then low income, because we've been really playing around with this and with the press. Does it have to be both or just one or the other? In other words, this community, what community I live in, is environmental justice. And I played around with the press on this where, yes, it's a minority community, but it's not low income. But so it still can be in that environmental justice.
Either or.
Either
or both. In fact, that's actually come up before. In my very first committee, where I was testifying on environmental justice, I had an African-American senator grill me on what I would know about environmental justice. And I informed him, well, it's not just about minority populations, it's also about areas of poverty. I'm from Galesburg, Illinois. Galesburg, Illinois is in the EJ area. Despite the fact that I look 50, I'm 39. Out of my 39 years, I've lived in the EJ area for 35. So it's not just areas of minority populations, but also poverty plays into that as well. In fact, most environmental justice areas downstate are all white communities.
Yeah, I've been looking at Will County, which has a pretty big environmental justice area, which I was surprised. So there's a lot of areas that are covered by it. What I'm really surprised at is you could just about kill off any development anywhere with this. If a community decides that they want to stop development on anything, and my friends from Reserve Management Group are here, and I've seen it done right in this area, and I've never seen an area cleaned up better than what Reserve Management Group did, and now being stopped in its tracks. Anything's possible.
Yeah, and can I just real quick, just for the, who here has?
I don't want to put you on the spot, Hal,
Yeah.
but it's the truth.
Who here has is with a facility with a cap or fee stop permit? A few? I imagine maybe some. Yeah, any one of you that has one of those permits would be impacted by environmental justice in a major way. Even just renewing your permit. With the way the environmentalists want to do, one of the differences we say is like, all right, if you have a cap or fee stop and you're going to make a significant modification, that's going to lead to significant emission increases, and those two words are very important in Illinois statute, then these certain low-end regulations will apply. The environmentalists want to say, well, if you have one and you're going to renew your permit, you need to go through this process. You have one question over there, Ted. I don't know if we have time.
Go ahead.
It's more complicated than just a percentage increase, but in the Illinois EPA Act, you have minor modifications, major modifications, significant modifications. They all have their own significance. Can be your highest level of trigger for modifications. And it's generally going to mean that you're going to have significant emission increases.
I've got just a couple of things to say, and I'm going to turn it over to Beth. She's got an announcement or two to do. First of all, I want to thank Donovan. He has been an enormous help to us, and he's helped me in Springfield turn some money around that's going to help CAIC, and I don't think I could have done it without him, so I want to thank Donovan. Also, I would suggest